going to get started with the final session of the day. My name's Joe Applegate. I'm with Geosyntec. I'm a senior principal up in Tallahassee. Can everybody hear me okay? Great. So this is the PFAS update and remediation case study review session. I'd like to recognize Jean for starting the PFAS forum. We had our first kickoff conference in May earlier this year. It was one of the first conferences since COVID, and really well attended. And there were sessions, every session was PFAS, whether it was regulatory, legal, chemical assessment, remediation. It was all about PFAS for a day and a half. So the next one is already scheduled for next May 2nd through the 4th, same place in Tampa. So I would encourage all of you that are interested in everything PFAS to submit abstracts, present, participate. That one was both virtual and in person, and just had an incredible turnout for the first year. So put a big plug in for that. Just a couple of tidbits on PFAS before I introduce our panel. As you know, in Florida, we have the provisional soil and groundwater numbers for PFOA and PFAS. I think we're all still waiting on EPA's new action plan and whether or not PFAS is going to be listed as hazardous or not. So we're still waiting. That's supposed to come out any day. I was informed that the infrastructure bill that was just signed by the president includes $4 billion for groundwater assessment treatment, and I think $4 billion, and George, you may speak on this, for water treatment. So it's great to see that there's actually federal money coming in to deal with all these PFAS issues across the country. So with that, we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to introduce all three speakers today. First up is George Naslas. George is a PG and a licensed site professional and vice president and environmental practice leader for Weston and Sampson. We really appreciate you coming down all the way to Florida. Sorry about the weather. Yesterday was blue sky, but nice and warm for you anyway. Next in line is Chad Northington. Chad is with REGENESIS. He is the Southeast Regional District Manager with REGENESIS and is a PE with over 20 years of experience. Many of you have worked with Chad on designing and implementing in situ technologies. And Chad's going to talk about PFAS and colloidal carbon treatment in groundwater today. Last but not least, I've had the pleasure of working with Olivia Cain. She's an environmental engineer out of our Clearwater office. She's got more than 4 years of experience on site assessment, remedial design, implementation. She's been doing quite a bit of work over the past 3 or 4 years on PFAS assessment and remediation. And it's going to talk about one of the first actual PFAS remediation projects at a fire training facility here in Florida, and give us some of the specifics that were just completed just a month or two ago. So this is hot off the press. So with that, I will turn it over to George.
Thank you very much. Great. So thanks everyone for being here. So I'm going to kick off this session, talk a little bit about PFAS and give a national perspective. This is sort of the 40,000 foot view of what's going on, what's hot, what's happening around the country. And then I think it'll tee it up nicely for the next two presentations. So I want to talk a little bit, just a little bit about PFAS and history. I know most folks in the room understand what we're talking about, and then we'll hit what the big issues are and kind of get some perspectives with what's going on from around the country. Oops. A little bit about Weston and Sampson. Some folks may know us. Our office in Florida is in Fort Myers. We're actually a 122-year-old infrastructure firm, environmental infrastructure. But why PFAS is important to us is we do a lot of work in the water supply side, wastewater industry in particular, and obviously environmental impacts. The nexus of those three disciplines is really where PFAS sits. We're headquartered in New England, but with offices up and down the East Coast. My background, I'm a hydrogeologist, studied geology at Imperial College London and did my master's at the Hydrogeologist program at the University of Nevada. So I come at this very much from a freight and transport perspective, but I've fortunately worked with a lot of colleagues that have other perspectives too, which has led to us forming an emerging contaminants work group at Weston and Sampson, where all the sides of and all the disciplines come together to evaluate this issue. So I know most folks know this. What are PFAS? Just going to hit it very quick. You know, as you know, fully or partially fluorinated organic compounds. PFAS is a family of compounds, right? We've seen anywhere from 3,000 to 10,000 compounds listed under the family of PFAS. The two ones that most people are most familiar with are PFOA and PFOS. But as most folks know, you know, they're everywhere. What makes them useful is their unique lipid and water repellent characteristics. So they've been used as coatings and surfaces, and they've also been dubbed forever chemicals as well because of they don't break down. Briefly on the history, as most folks know, Teflon was really developed in the 30s, and 40s as for non-stick coatings. It's been around for a long, long time. But PFOS and PFOA started really in the 50s and 60s, with production ramping up through the 70s until really the 2000s, where production was ceased, replaced by the replacement compounds that we'll talk a little bit in a minute. But PFOS occurs in stain-resistant products and firefighting foam, and that's one of the big sources that folks know about. PFOA tends to be more in protective coatings. So as I mentioned, historic uses, PFAS compounds are in everything from food packaging to stain-resistant carpets to simonizing your car to aqueous film-forming foam, the firefighting foams that we find. So that's why they're ubiquitous. That's why we're finding them everywhere. When we talk about health effects in humans, toxicology is poorly known, really. There's a lot of studies that have happened in the last few years, but the data is inconsistent, I would say. But there is evidence clearly about fetal growth, potential cancers, persistent liver effects, child and adult adiposity. I had to look that up, but it actually means having a big gut like I have. So a lot of potential impacts to humans, and evidence too that they bioaccumulate. So unfortunately, I think most of us in this room probably have some level of PFAS in our bloodstream. I want to talk a little bit about politics and how that's impacting how we view PFAS, how the feds and the states are really addressing this around the country, and how they have been over the past few years, which of course leads into the regulatory obligations depending where you work. We're going to talk about water supplies because the main source of PFAS exposure is through ingestion. Point sources, wastewater treatment facilities, biosolids is a big issue. And it's interesting, I think one of the takeaways today is you'll see how quickly regulations have been changing over the last few years. Just yesterday, I saw a letter from New England Water Environment Association to the Massachusetts DEP, particularly pleading the case. It was very strongly worded, actually, for wastewater treatment plants and the challenges they face right now, because they end up being a collection point for a lot of water from around a large sewer shed and become a point source discharge. So this is a real problem for them. Landfills, fire training academies, which we're going to hear about, which will be great, and various products. Okay, so this is an American Waterworks Association slide. It's very busy. I like it because it just captures kind of the PFAS cycle in the environment. You know, multiple point sources ending up in soil and groundwater, be it from runoff, be it from land application of biosolids, be it from aerial discharge. Water treatment plants take the water out, it gets concentrated back at the wastewater treatment plants, back into the cycle, and the cycle repeats. So this is why when you may have a point source of PFAS at one area, but because of how it's collected and moves, can end up getting spread around in different areas. And for example, land applications of biosolids is proving to be a real problem. And the state of Maine actually has just completely overnight shut that down. So that has created problems. You know, PFAS is in the news all the time. These are headlines I just picked up from last week locally. So this is talking about the state of Massachusetts recommending that people limit fish consumption caught in 5 Cape Cod ponds. So for those that may or may not know, Cape Cod, these are kettle ponds, so it's groundwater in, groundwater out. And similarly in New Hampshire, which actually has a very different geology, but the same issue. They're finding PFAS in surface water in the ponds, and now are seeing it, you know, ending up in the fish. So this has become a real big issue just this year. City of Portsmouth in New Hampshire, this is a project that is near and dear to my company. We designed a park with synthetic fields, and there's allegations that PFAS are coming off the turf field. And that's a whole separate conversation I'm willing to have with anyone who wants to talk about it afterwards. But these are the headlines. Whether or not they're right or wrong, this is what's happening around the country. And you know, when you start talking about synthetic fields and whether they have PFAS in or not, it really shines a light on products, choosing the right product and making sure that we're being protective of the environment around where these facilities are being built. Okay, politics. Politics, flavors everything we do. As you know, new EPA Administrator Michael Regan. He came from North Carolina, where obviously there was a lot of high-profile PFAS sites, particularly the Cape Fear watershed. So under his stewardship, we've seen a change of direction from the federal government. And as you mentioned, the PFAS strategic roadmap just came out, hot off the press. I think it was dated a month ago, but it's just been released. And that's going to be really interesting to see where that goes. However, thus far, it's been the states that have been leading. And you know, we've seen two approaches, right? Some states are setting standards and saying, okay, these are the standards above or below. You know, these are our action limits. In some cases, they're standards. In some cases, states have designated PFAS or certain PFAS compounds as hazardous materials, like New York. Other states are taking the approach of, well, let's understand what our issue is. So in South Carolina, for example, they're looking at their water supplies first. They have a lot of surface water supplies, so they're looking at intakes, and they're coming at it from the approach of, well, we're going to hold to the EPA health advisory, but we're trying to get our arms around how big a problem we have. And a number of states have taken that approach. The key, of course, is once you've got information, managing that information and risk communication. In the plenary yesterday, there was we were talking about that, and obviously we're in a post-Flint, Michigan world, so it's so important how, as agencies collect the data, how they are presenting it. I know we've got some folks from Florida DOH here, and I'm interested in hearing from them about how their program is going and how that information is stored and communicated. So who's driving the regulations? As I mentioned, the states have been for the last 3, 4, 5, 6 years. In Minnesota, Michigan are out in front of this, California, as you might expect. In the Northeast, it was the state of Vermont that really stepped up. Vermont and New Hampshire, those two states have a lot of private private bedrock wells. So the whole state's considered a drinking water resource. So they came at it and looked at the 70 parts per trillion and said, no, that's not good enough. We want to evaluate our most sensitive population, i.e. babies, and they dropped their limit to 20. And initially it was for one of the two compounds, either of the two compounds. Then it became the sum of the two compounds, and now it's sum of 5 compounds in Vermont. And a number of other states have followed suit and actually gone beyond that. So we'll talk about that in a second. But it's great to see that, well, it'll be interesting to see how it plays out, but the federal government now is playing catch up, but it really, this PFAS strategic roadmap that they've just come out with will be really interesting to see how that gets implemented. So 3 main focuses: research, looking at the toxicology of the key compounds. In fact, I saw a press release 2 days ago, I think it was, saying that they're acknowledging that the health guidance that they have of 70 parts per trillion may not be right, that they're going to look at the toxicology of PFOA and PFAS and see if that comes down. Well, looking at what the states have done, it's highly likely that it will, I would expect. But again, you know, some of those decisions are driven by other factors. They want to restrict, come up with a plan to restrict use and then remediate sites. So, you know, as of October, as of last month, the roadmap was published and they released their advance notice of the proposed rulemaking to consider PFOA, PFAS, GenX, and PFAS as a hazardous substance, which, you know, we all play in this world. It's going to impact due diligence. It's going to impact disposal. It's going to, it has far-reaching implications. But some of the states are already doing that. So in some ways, it's catch-up again. And then, interestingly, the next round of UCMR testing around the country is going to include 29 PFAs. So a little different to the UCMR 3, which highlighted the presence of PFAs in many supplies. Okay, not going to go through every single one, but the plan does come up with 31 key EPA actions. And what I think is interesting here is a highly, highly aggressive plan, starting with looking at the toxicology of some of these compounds that we talked about, ending up with rulemaking. Now, can the feds get through it in the time frame they're predicting? Remains to be seen. But what is interesting is, you know, this is clearly a shift in priority than where they've been at before. So I think this is going to be very interesting. And they're already started in some ways with things like for you know, wastewater treatment plants. They're now requiring testing for wastewater outfalls and things like that. So it's going to be very, very interesting as this unfolds. So we look at impact. I mentioned drinking water focus, how many supplies are impacted, what are the sources, and then, you know, that leads to enforcement. So as I said, the states are all at different points in this. New Hampshire, for example, required that every active landfill monitoring program and has waste assessment program that they test for PFAS. That was a requirement. And they uploaded all that information to a database. Other states are kind of doing something similar. Massachusetts is starting to require that. But the problem there is then you become, if you've got it in your own well, you become a PRP. So people are refusing to test. And so this is getting very, very thorny right now because it can lead to enforcement, as we've talked about. So, you know, mentioned the states leading the charge. In some instances, like the picture of here of a grassroots group in Maryland, some of these projects, you know, some of the impetus, I should say, just happened really from grassroots involvement. My company's working on a different site in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, working for the city where they've got municipal wells. They were shut down because of adjacent to Pease Air Force Base. So we had PFAS was found in the water system. This was before New Hampshire DES had any regulations in place, but the public outrage and you know, and the pressure resulted in an immediate shutdown of those wells. And so really the assessment and evaluation of that system and the source area, of course, that the Air Force was already looking at, went way out in front of where the regulations were at that time. Florida has the dynamic plan. I'm sure a lot of folks in the room have looked at this, have worked under this, are part of this. So it's interesting too that, you know, the dynamic plan really is highlighting, you know, as I read it, coordination between different data sources. I have a different example up in the Northeast where one of the agencies, the Department of Health, had collected data, had that data, stored that data, but hadn't communicated to the Department of Environmental Protection that who was responsible then for responding to PFAS. And so it created a little bit of stress between those agencies. So I think the dynamic plan, again, I'd love to hear from the Florida folks here, is designed to iron out some of those challenges. So this is a snapshot, and it's interesting just to see where we're at across the country, right? 17 nanograms per liter, parts per trillion, EPA health advisory. Many states are following that. But where are other states? I mentioned Vermont, 20 nanograms per liter for 5 compounds. Massachusetts has gone for 6. New Hampshire has standards for PFOS and PFOA of 12 and 15. New York, 10 and 10. So, you know, the states are all over the place, and it sometimes feel it's a race to the bottom sometimes. And as we all know in this, you know, as environmental professionals, the lower we go, the harder it is to test and have reliable tests. Interestingly, Canada and Australia and Germany have a completely different set of numbers that they're working from. You know, Canada 200 and 600, is that right? I don't know. It really shines a light on where the toxicological studies are at and the assumptions that went into those. Soil screening standards are coming in. You mentioned Florida has some soil screening standards and will be enacting standards. And this, of course, really shines a light on one of the challenges we're facing right now, particularly in soil management. I was listening this morning, yesterday rather, in the plenary again, talking about you know, management of contaminated soil. It's something I do a lot of in my day-to-day job, particularly working in the Northeast where there's a lot of old legacy sites, a lot of construction. You know, it really shines a light on the need to do your due diligence. And what we're seeing now is receiving facilities either requiring testing of soil, and as most of you know, the soil methodologies for PFAS are kind of all over the place, but they're either requiring testing or requiring certification from the environmental professional that there's no PFAS there, and which of course now will have cost implications, schedule implications, etc. We worked on a project in New Hampshire. We only had like a 50 to 80 cubic yard pile of soil, but we knew there was PFAS in it from the site history, and no one would take it. We actually had to go to Canada. So as you can imagine, there's paperwork, there's schedule implications, there was cost implications. And fortunately, we're able to move that soil just before lockdown and the Canadian border shutting. So, but that Canada can't be the solution. So soil management is going to be a real big issue moving forward. So we'll talk a little bit about water treatment. My company comes at it from the perspective of water supply, where we've been looking at primarily granular activated carbon, GAC units, but we've put in what, seven or so emergency systems now for large scale water supply municipal wells. We've got GAC units, we've got resin units, we've done pilots where we've looked at combinations of both, and they work very well. Reverse osmosis works really well, and we've also worked on a lot of point of entry and point of use systems. But Interestingly, there's many other technologies out there. So I'm looking forward to Chad's talk next about some of the in situ technologies and how and where they're at. So I'm going to skip over this slide because that just we're going to hear about this next. So I thought it was interesting, you know, a lot of us have been working in the environmental field for a long time. I can't remember any compound that, or family of compounds that got as much attention as PFAS so quickly. And I just thought it, you know, I just threw out a bunch of milestones that have happened really since the COVID outbreak, right? It seems like yesterday, but it seems like a long time ago. But March 2020 to now, what's been happening around the country? Vermont came out with their Summer 5. New Jersey came out with their standards. Colorado came out with numeric values. New Hampshire formalized their standards. Michigan came out with drinking water standards. New York came out with drinking water standards. Massachusetts formalized theirs and came out with the Summer 6. Illinois came out with the PFOA Health Advisory. Texas, 16 PFAS compounds now have standards, as they do in Hawaii, where their action levels actually. Illinois came out with new guidance for PFBS. Not so many states have guidance yet for PFBS. EPA is looking at that compound. Rhode Island came out with standards for 6. Interestingly, just last month, the European Union came out with a PFAS limit of 500. So, you know, much more lax than what we have here in the States, but interestingly, it's a sum of PFAS, and I don't know how many compounds they count into to get to that 500. And of course, California came out with some recent goals. And then, of course, we have the new information from the feds that they're starting to look at this seriously, and are going to evaluate the toxicology studies of PFOA and PFOS. All this has happened in 18 months. So it's amazing at the pace of change. So takeaways, regulations are changing. You know, what happens in other parts of the country we need to pay attention to, particularly if you play in the water supply world, where, you know, you may be finding concentrations in groundwater around 30 to 40, which we see in Massachusetts all the time, or low teens, because you might be below the limit today, but if the limit changes or the state decides to go to a sum, then suddenly these sites are going to require cleanup. EPA is getting involved, as we mentioned, and the emphasis is changing. It's been monitoring and understanding, but it's leading to enforcement. And I'm certainly seeing that in the state of Massachusetts and starting to see it in some of the other states, in New Hampshire particularly. So, you know, takeaway, stay current with regulatory requirements and treatment technologies. Where do we find this information? So a big shout out to the ITRC fact sheets. If you don't know this website, this should be the one takeaway. Please go to them. They have so much information that's updated all the time, which is really great. Makes it easier for us as environmental professionals who you may play in multiple states. And there's some other links there. So that's my talk, and this is my contact information. So please feel free to reach out, and any questions.
I would like to ask for questions after each presentation. We're going to have plenty of time. We'll probably get you out a few minutes early today, but would anybody have any questions for George on the national perspective? I guess I would have one. You had mentioned that you know, a lot of this water is being directed toward wastewater treatment plants, and a lot of these states are adopting, you know, groundwater, drinking water levels.
Right.
Are they pursuing surface water criteria? That's kind of a big issue in Florida right now because the screening number is so low.
Right. So we're seeing that we're seeing surface water. The attention has shifted to surface water. I mentioned the ponds in Massachusetts and New Hampshire. You asked me 6 months ago, I wouldn't have been aware of surface water being an issue to the extent it is today. So yes, we're starting to see screening. The other thing that's happening is, you know, what the labs or EPA is coming out with standard testing. That's part of the problem when you're talking about other media, particularly wastewater treatment plants, right? It's a variable waste stream that you're testing on a good day. So how do you test it? So that's one of the main focuses right now, is nailing down a good testing methodology so that then you can come in with standards. So yeah, we're starting to see that a lot. The other thing we're seeing is some NIPD's permits for the wastewater treatment plants under the MS4 program are requiring testing. Hence the pushback. I mentioned the letter that I saw yesterday, because rightly they're nervous. What do we do? We're collecting water from everybody, and now what? We don't want to be seen as the bad guys when we're trying to do a good thing for the environment. So it's very, very difficult.
Thank you. Any other questions for George?
Thank you.
Thank you very much, George. Next up, we have Chad Northington.
So I told George it's difficult to follow somebody with a really cool accent like that, so I'm going to do my best. So good afternoon, everyone. It has been super refreshing to see so many familiar faces to get back into this, and really appreciate the opportunity to pick up with a story that we started several years ago, talking about the use of colloidal activated carbon for the mitigation and treatment of PFAS. So a lot's been happening since then in that world. I'm going to share a story with you that we have a case study that I think is very representative of what we've been doing really across the globe over the last several years. So really, question is, forever chemicals. Do we have a forever solution? All right, so keep that in mind. Let's see what we got. So I would be remiss if I did not actually introduce the real brains behind the operation. I'm just the mouthpiece for all these folks that are part of our PFAS team. Both doctors Paul Erickson and Kristen Thornton out in California have been essential and vital to the development of our technologies, both Plume Stop that we'll talk about today, as well as some of our flux mapping tools. Jeremy Bernstingle, hailing from Bath, England. He is the man behind the curtain for Plume Force, which is a software that I'm going to talk about a little bit today that we use to model Plume Stop longevity. And then Dr. Liu has been supporting this entire PFAS team. So I know a lot of you have heard me talk about Plume Stop or others in the past, but typically we're co-applying it with other reagents to degrade and have a destructive technology for the contaminants. In the case of PFAS, that's a little bit different. So you may not know what we've been doing with it in the PFAS world. So I want to dig into that a little bit today. But just in case you aren't familiar with Plume Stop, there's really two key things here. One is the size of the carbon. So this is 1 to 2 micron scale carbon. That's basically the size of a red blood cell, if you want to put that in perspective, relative to maybe GAC, granular activated carbon, more on the scale of 500 to 1,000 microns. And then the second thing is that this is actually has an organic polymer that allows for a unique dispersion within the subsurface of this. So we can do high volume, low pressure, wide area distribution with this technology, which is vital for forming essentially what is a carbon filter, a purifying filter in the subsurface. So I think one of the ways to really kind of understand the technology is to get under the hood a little bit. So take a look at the patents associated with it. I know that sounds really boring sometimes, but it was kind of enlightening to me when I start thinking about what is it we said we can do with this stuff. One, like I said, there's a unique polymer, a dispersion chemistry that's vital for distribution. The second is the ability to engineer the aquifer hydrophobicity. Another way to saying that is engineering the retardation in the subsurface. That's a unique quality for an in situ reagent that I'm going to dig into a little bit more with the modeling and what we do with that fact. So keep that in mind, aquifer hydrophobicity. Say that really fast several times. And we also are able to deal with back diffusion because the longevity and the permanency of this reagent in the subsurface. And I'll kind of visually share that with you in a little bit. And of course, again, this small size of the carbon is vital to getting it to where it needs to be. So really, in generally most of our designs, what we're really trying to do is target what we call the flux transport zone. So this is the area of the plume that the architecture, the behavior of it is shaped by. So this is where the contaminant mass is moving through the aquifer matrix through these very high permeability zones in most cases. And then what that allows us to do, once we have it in place there, we can deal with back diffusion from lower permeability units. So the carbon remains in place and keeps working for us after there's been a change in that aquifer concentration gradient. And even if we have stuff above, maybe infiltrating from the vadose zone, for example, we can still manage that in this high flux transport zone. So that's kind of our target. So kind of funny being at the Florida Remediation Conference, and I'm going to tell you what remediation means, right? So according to ITRC, let's just back up and think about what remediation is. So a process used to reduce or eliminate the risk for humans in the environment that may result from exposure to harmful chemicals, right? So eliminate the risk to exposure. So with that being the case, we know that in our world, risk equals the product of hazard times exposure. Okay, so if we can bind up the plume stop in situ, again, this is not degradation or destruction, but a binding up, absorption of this, then we can eliminate any potential down gradient for exposure. And by eliminating exposure, we eliminate risk, very simply. We do this all the time, really, with risk-based corrective action, no further actions where we leave contaminant mass in place. So this isn't really a new concept, but this is what's behind it. So that being said, I'm sure some folks are thinking, well, it's a carbon filter in the subsurface. It's going to fill up. There's going to be breakthrough, right, at some point. And that is very true because we're not destroying or degrading mass in this case. However, probably the more important questions are, how long is that going to take? Can we model that? And what could we do about it if we do have breakthrough? So let's take a look at some of those questions. So first of all, I mentioned earlier about modeling the aquifer hydrophobicity, that we have the ability to engineer the retardation factor. So essentially what that means, or as a reminder, the retardation factor means, so a value of 1 means that contaminant molecule and a water molecule are basically moving at the same velocity in the groundwater. So as we start to increase the retardation factor, think of it as a slowing down of that molecule, the contaminant molecule, through the aquifer. Okay, so you can see for different plume concentrations, let's go down to the 10 ppb. Now keep in mind 10 micrograms per liter, that's 10,000 parts per trillion. So that definitely falls in the realm of a lot of our PFAS plumes that we're dealing with. So for PFOA and PFOS, we can increase the retardation factor to values of 4,000 to 10,000. That's orders of magnitude difference in the movement of that contaminant molecule. So that's significant, that's very significant. So what can we do with that information? So here's kind of a practical example. So think of a 16-foot wide barrier, plume stop barrier in the subsurface. We got about 160 feet per year as a seepage velocity, so a decent clip. And then we're looking at a plume that's 100 ppb. So that's about 100,000 parts per trillion, okay? So for the groundwater transit time to move through that zone, it'd be about a month, about 36 days. If we look at the equivalent for PFOA, we're talking about 60 years, 6 decades for that contaminant molecule to work its way through that same zone. If we look at PFOS, which is even more absorbed, we're talking about 2 centuries, 200 years. Okay, so you can see the difference in the ability to engineer that has some implications. And we know in today's climate and today's world that having peer-reviewed and third-party type articles out there is important. This is just an example of one that corroborates some of the numbers that we've come up with by a third party. And I'll have a couple of references to this at the end here. So why take this approach? So we call this passive plume management. A lot of folks think of it as putting in a permeable reactive barrier of sorts, and that's true too. So you don't have any infrastructure, all right? So that means no O&M. That also means, as George was saying earlier, we're not generating any media above ground that might have to be dealt with as a hazardous substance. So that's coming down the pipe, and we need to be kind of preemptively thinking about that. So no waste stream is being generated through this. And we know carbon in all its forms, colloidal, micron scale, GAC, all of it can manage to treat down to the part per trillion range. So a lot of things can't achieve that. And I'm going to show you in the modeling that we can achieve decades of treatment by putting a single application in the ground. So that obviously sounds pretty cost effective. So here's a story from Michigan. I hail from Michigan, don't hold that against me. Former Michigander turned Floridian. But this is an example. It's not the longest running site that we have. This is about 3 years now going on below cleanup levels. We have others that are a little bit longer. We've all been in this game not too long as it is. So 3 years isn't too bad in this story. So this is the Grayling Army Airfield near where I used to live up in northern Michigan. And it's actually got some interesting history. It's the largest National Guard training facility in the country. I didn't know that when I lived up there. It's over a century old. It's been around since the early 1900s, almost 150,000 acres. Our focus area is only about 1,000 of that at the Grayling Army Airfield. So there's been a long history here. There's diesel releases, later chlorinated solvents were identified, and now PFAS, as we're going to find at a lot of sites. And it has kind of a traditional remediation history, pump and treat, SVE, air sparge. So kind of honing in on the subject area there, you can see the airfield, and then we're down towards what was the former bulk storage tanks location. If we look at the geology, as expected, a sand and gravel, some clay lenses, moving along pretty good, 250 feet or so per year for the seepage velocity. And we're going to target an interval between 15 and 27 feet. So we're going to actually divide that up into 2 intervals that you'll see later with our monitoring wells, nested monitoring wells. Pretty low levels of chlorinated solvents, but this is a commingled plume. Again, a very common scenario. Most cases we're seeing that these are commingled hydrocarbon or chlorinated solvent plumes with PFAS. The total PFAS is around 130 ppt, with PFOS being kind of the driver. And there's a bunch of sensitive receptors, down gradient, just down gradient is a residential area. The Asable River, where I used to fish and camp, you know, so it's starting to hit home for all of us as we're finding out how ubiquitous this stuff is. So the very place I used to hang out and fish with my family is near the subject site that we're talking about today. So I mentioned earlier modeling software. So Plume Force is something that was developed internally for us. And this is essentially a long-term predictive model, so fate and transport model. And it takes a lot of stuff into consideration, again, when you go under the hood. So we're looking at competitive absorption. When it's applicable, we're looking at degradation and destruction. So if we do have a commingled plume, we can degrade and destroy those contaminants via other biotic or abiotic means. So that's taken into consideration as well. And we're also looking at compound-specific isotherms. So how well do certain compounds absorb to the carbon? And that varies for each compound. And it actually varies with the type of carbon. So granular activated carbon has a different isotherm than colloidal activated carbon, which you may not know, but the smaller particle size allows for more efficiency with the smaller particle size for the colloidal carbon. And then we can do this for all the different classes of compounds, whether they're chlorinated, PFAS, hydrocarbons, et cetera. So then there's a bunch of parameters that we can dump into this. Some of them are fixed based on the geology, whether that's the porosity, for example, based on the soil type, and we can look at hydraulic conductivities, but then we can start manipulating some of these things. Well, how thick of a barrier? How much of a dose? Things of that nature. And doing that, we can either A, predict the longevity, or we can use a certain dose to see what kind of longevity that we want to target. So we can start messing around with some of these parameters. So here's kind of a typical example of an output from that software. You can see the different contaminant types up there in the key. I'll point out for the inputs on this, we're assuming an infinite source, and we're also assuming no degradation, which neither is really the case. So it's a very conservative estimate. So looking at groundwater flowing from left to right on here, you can see putting in the 10-foot barrier. We can look at each one of these compounds and predict how long they're going to stay within that barrier. Again, that absorption isn't a permanent process, but we're changing the retardation factor. We're altering the FOC. So we can look at how long it's going to take for breakthrough to occur here. So we look at both the chlorinateds, we're looking at the different PFAS compounds. And you can see that, I jumped ahead. In this model, we would assume that it would take over 75 years for that to occur. So again, that's a conservative estimate. These are fairly low level concentrations, but that's a really long time. So here's a conceptual rendering of the site. You can see it's 9 direct push injection points. There's a series of nested wells, both up gradient and down gradient. And so basically we're creating what would be a simple plume cutoff barrier. So the actual site, inclusive of the porta potty. I don't know why we don't include those in the renderings, the conceptual renderings, but it's always a part of the site. And then we have the 9 injection points and the up gradient nested well pairs and 2 down gradient nested well pairs. So here's the layout here. Again, these are the nested well pairs up gradient at the top and the 2 down gradient well pairs. You can see our 9 injection points and some of the spacing. So it's a pretty tight spacing, in this case, about 6 feet between points. We want to ensure good overlap. A true barrier is being formed here. And then another thing that's really cool about using carbon in the subsurface is we can use it as a tracer. We can look at placement validation, as we like to call it. So essentially, we can do these searcher cores and go out and take cores as we start remediation in the field, and we can make adjustments. So we might assume that we can go a little further than the ROI. So we might step out at the edge of the barrier and see if we get influence. If we don't, we can move back into our ROI and make those adjustments real time in something I would call dynamic remediation. So we make those changes in the field to optimize based on the baseline being our design. So you can see here, we started out a little bit further than we anticipated from the ROI. We didn't see it. We moved back in and we started getting these searcher cores showing evidence of the carbon distribution. And we did that across the barrier in different locations. So here's a great visual where it becomes very evident. We've got carbon distribution. So if you look to the right, that's the top of the surface, going down to that lower permeability clay at 30 feet. And then about at the beginning of the water table at 15 feet BGS, down to 27 feet, we got good solid distribution of that reagent across the entire target zone. And remember I said earlier that target zone represents what we're calling the flux transport zone. That's really where we want to get the bulk of the reagent mass. And that later will also help deal with any back diffusion from that low permeability clay and anything that might be coming in from above. So sometimes it's not that obvious, depending on the soil type and the color and things of that nature and the concentrations. So there's other things that we can do. Sometimes we'll do what we call shaker vials for placement validation. So that's essentially adding a little water to some of the soil samples and we can start to see that plume stop come out. And then of course, at the monitoring well, we want to see influence at the monitoring well. It's very evident. And we want to make sure we're achieving that ROI, and we can use colorimetric test kits to confirm the concentrations against the design as well. So, and that will eventually deposit and become a permanent part of the aquifer matrix. So it binds to the soils, and that is permanent. So you won't see it lasting in the wells forever. Usually within a quarter, it'll be gone. It's a great indicator up front. So here's a couple charts I'm going to walk you through. So this represents total PFAS. The red line above is the influent concentration, so it's steady and trending upward a little bit over the course of this period. And then you can see the 2 lines below represent those sequential nested well pairs. So the first one and the second one, you can see an immediate drop to non-detect of the PFAS compound concentrations right off the bat. And those concentrations are sustained through this particular duration here of about 200 days. And then there was an interest in figuring out, well, what's going on further down gradient now? So we added additional well clusters at 26 and 45 feet. And then we added some additional wells. The red wells represent monitoring wells that we installed basically to recalibrate our groundwater flow direction. It was assumed at the beginning, and that's why we kind of arced that barrier to kind of capture variations potentially in that groundwater flow direction. And in fact, after we put in those additional wells, it was a little bit shifted and justified putting in that kind of formation for the barrier. So here's a second one. This is showing the other down gradient well pairs. Again, we see sustained influent concentrations for the PFAS coming in, sustained non-detect for those closest down gradient wells. And then you can see a little blip at the end. I don't have a pointer here, but for that furthest down gradient well cluster, that you can see some slight detection, but then it tails off. And that's a standard response as we see the treated groundwater front, that clean water front, moving through that zone and impacting in a positive way the down gradient wells. So that's the PFAS story. And if we look at the chlorinated solvents, the PCE here in this case, same story. We got a steady influent concentration, that top line. We see an initial drop right off the bat from those closest wells, and then a little bit more pronounced lag going from the down gradient wells that eventually tail off to non-detect. So all of this has been sustained now for about 3 years. Kind of put it in a simpler perspective, you can see the average coming in for the PFAS in the red line, and down below you see after injection the average across all of those wells below 10 ppt, the detection level. So this was a pilot scale test. It's being expanded. Obviously, we were able to verify and show the ability to confirm distribution of the carbon, sustain those reductions now for 3 years. We only have, I think, 100 to go before we reach the end of our modeling period. So we'll keep you up to date. But this is happening at sites across the globe that we've been working on. We do anticipate this treatment here to last for decades based on the modeling efforts. And again, this is much lower cost alternative to other things that may have been considered for the site. So essentially, this passive plume management strategy gives us the ability to provide a risk mitigation strategy for PFAS. And if nothing else, we're stopping the expansion of these plumes that really want to run free and wild across the remedial landscape. A lot of these plumes are well beyond a mile long now that we're starting to delineate them. There's nothing to attenuate them, right? So they're just running free across the remedial landscape. But we really are getting closer to having maybe not a forever solution for forever chemicals, but at least a very long-term one. So with that, there's a few references there. Maybe when we get handouts and such later, you can use those codes for some of our resources and some other papers and journal articles that are out there. And with that, I will take any questions you have, except why is that guy not have glasses and more gray hair? I don't know, but time to update my headshot. So anyway, over to you, Joe.
We have a question in the back there. Hold on for the microphone.
Yeah, Chad, thanks very much. That was a great presentation, really interesting work. I did have a question though. If you're creating a zone within the in the aquifer that the PFAS is going to sorb to, and you're talking about decades, let's say 100 parts per trillion or 100 micrograms per liter or 150 or whatever the concentration is, have you done any work or calculations of what that soil concentration would be within that zone after, say, 10 years, 20 years of plume stop? So you're basically creating a concentration zone, and I'm just wondering what the legacy of that is over time. I mean, I understand the risk perspective and, cleaning it up and protecting from an exposure standpoint.
Yep.
But are you creating a zone that has to, maybe that's a good thing. You can then focus on that at some point in the future.
Exactly. It's a great point. And I think there's a couple of things to consider in that. One is, so we are accumulating all that mass in a very isolated zone. So, hey, let's go dig it out if we get to a point where maybe we have a assumed soil or demonstrated soil exceedance. And keep in mind, that concentration jump, from and depends where these standards end up, but like with groundwater now for whatever chlorinated solvents, you have to have a lot of mass in the soil relatively speaking to the groundwater concentrations, right? So if that makes sense, we got a lot of sorb mass before we're exceeding a standard. So we can pick up a lot of that dissolved low level phase stuff for quite a while before we might be thinking about hitting a soil exceedance. And the third thing I'd say is that, this technology is going to evolve along with other technologies as everything does. And I really think in short order that we'll start to see things we can use in conjunction with this to maybe degrade and destroy this like we do every other thing. So there's whispers of bugs that might be able to handle some of these things, and other destructive technologies that if we take them to the subsurface could be used synergistically with this. So good question. Paco? Sure.
Sort of the feature that's keeping advancing.
Is it defined as an engineering control? Is that what you're asking? Sure, I will default to Mr. John Wright or others who can define it how they shall, but yes, I've seen it described that way, but I think it's going to be very regulatory dependent on whether it's described in that manner and monitored in that manner as well. Yeah.
Chad, I had a question.
I'm always afraid of Joe's questions.
How does the GAC absorption efficiency for PFAS compare to like our other VOCs, SVOCs, chlorinated solvents?
Okay, yeah. So, assuming, they're isotherms, so assuming same temperature and things like that, what we find is like PCE, which we'd all say it loves to be sorbed, right? If we compare PFO and PFOS, they're about 2 to 3 times more sorbable, if you will. So they actually are more attractive. Now, I'm sure others are thinking, well, what about chain length, carbon chain length, functional groups? All of those impact the absorption. So there are some things that certainly aren't absorbed as well as PFOA and PFOS, but we'll tackle those two first at least. But,
And to add to that, on the plume force modeling,
Mhm.
do you take into account all the PFAS compounds, not just PFOA and PFOS?
yeah, we do take them all into consideration. We might not model each one individually, because there's just not enough known about some of these, but we can just make assumptions based on chain length, functional groups, how they're going to behave. So we might lump some of them together and assign certain KOC values and things of that nature to help us model things that are, maybe we haven't run a true isotherm on it, but we can make some assumptions about it based on its size and behavior and such. Yeah. Okay. All right, good questions, guys. Oh, Donna. Not yet. Probably never. But we can walk through it and kind of play with it. And we've done that sort of demonstration, but haven't handed over the keys. So.
This is Sunil Pindia, calling.
And next up, we have Olivia Cain.
Oh, look at that. Hey, everybody. As Joe mentioned previously, today I'm going to be talking about an ISR that we recently completed at a site here in Florida. We believe that this is one of the first interim source removals for PFAS at a fire training facility in the state, and we encountered some very unique challenges that I'm going to share with you today. I'd like to thank the FDEP for the opportunity to work on this project with them and to be able to present it to you all today. During this presentation, I'm going to provide an overview of our project and a little site history. I'm going to review the objectives of our ISR, discuss the project's timeline and some considerations we made during the planning process, share some lessons learned during the project, and highlight some key takeaways. Our site is an active fire training facility located in Central Florida. The facility has stored and used AFFF historically for training exercises, and they've used a variety of different AFFF products, including protein-based foams. Geosyntec has conducted assessment activities since the beginning of 2019, which has included both soil and groundwater assessment, but I'm going to focus on the soil today because we're talking about the interim source removal. That's included the collection of over 800 soil samples at 150 boring locations to evaluate the extent and magnitude of PFAS across the site. One source area we identified is their former drum and tote storage area, which you can see pictured on this screen. We have identified concentrations in soil of PFAS, PFOS specifically, and concentrations greater than 100 milligrams per kilogram, and some samples greater than 200 milligrams per kilogram. We have had a few exceedances of PFOA, but they've mostly been leachability-based criteria exceedances and not direct exposure exceedances. So our driver at the site really is PFAS specifically, and that's not that surprising considering that the source is AFFF related. As mentioned on the previous slide, our site-wide soil assessment has included the collection of 800 samples, but this specific area where they used to store the drums and totes, we've collected close to 450 samples at 64 boring locations, which is quite extensive given the size of the site, but that was really to refine our understanding with the end goal being remediation. So we really wanted to understand exactly how much was there and at what extent. This slide includes a cross-section of this former drum and tote area. If you can see the colors, the yellow contour is the concentrations in soil that are above the residential direct exposure SETL for PFAS. The orange contour is the concentrations in soil that are greater than the industrial SETL. And the gray contour is the concentrations that are greater than the provisional leachability-based criteria. As you can see, the geology at this site consists of superficial sands interbedded with clayey sand and sandy clay, followed by limestone. And the limestone varies greatly with topography across the site. You encounter it at all sorts of different depths. You never know what you're going to get when you're hand augering. And the depth to water ranges between 35 and 45 feet. And as I mentioned previously, our primary COC at the site is PFAS. During our assessment activities in and around the former drum and tote area, we identified concentrations greater than the provisional residential SETL from land surface all the way to the water table, which, as I mentioned, is 35 feet at a minimum. And our concentrations above PFAS, or concentrations of PFAS above the industrial SCTL extended from land surface to 4 feet, but approximately 35 to 45% of the total mass from land surface to the water table was within the top 2 feet alone, which is noted in the red square on the screen. The image on the left of this slide illustrates the horizontal extent of our excavation areas. The blue shading indicates the excavation proposed based on residential SCTL exceedances, and the purple is representing our proposed excavation based on industrial SCTL exceedances. And it might be kind of hard to see, but if you notice the little black squiggly lines, that's actually the footprint of where the drums and totes were formerly stored in this area. The goal of our ISR was to meet the requirements outlined in 62-780 for an interim source removal and for engineering controls. And we wanted to be protective of human health and the environment. So our approach was to eliminate the direct exposure concerns by removing soil within the top 2 feet that was greater than the residential SCTL, and then removing all soils that were greater than the industrial SCTL for PFAS, which, as I mentioned, happened to be from 0 to 4 feet. And to help reduce infiltration and leaching from impacted soils left in place, we installed a low permeability barrier at the bottom of our excavation prior to backfilling. The timeline for this project was pretty quick, and that was driven by the testing schedule at the facility. We submitted our ISR work plan in November of last year, and we began construction in April of this year. This brought about some planning challenges, but we were able to successfully implement our ISR in time. As many of you probably can assume, there are many logistical challenges for planning for a PFAS source removal, not just the expedited timeline for this project in particular, but just the nature of the contaminant itself. Some of these challenges include how should the excavated materials be handled and disposed? At our site in particular, we were managing soil, green waste, including vegetation and trees and concrete. And what disposal facilities will accept your PFAS soils when you have concentrations that are in the hundreds of milligrams per kilogram? When you're excavating, is there a risk of exposure to the on-site workers during construction? And when you install the liner to help reduce infiltration, how will the water be collected and discharged? And the remainder of my presentation, I'm going to review some of these challenges, and I'm going to start with the disposal consideration. Literature suggests that PFAS can accumulate in trees, some aquatic plants, some vegetables and grasses. So there's the potential that the leaf litter and the vegetation at our site may have been impacted with PFAS as well. The sampling procedures and the lab analysis can be costly because this is a pretty fancy sampling. And within our work area in particular, we were proposing to remove over 10 trees to achieve the horizontal extents, which would have required us to collect quite a few samples to evaluate whether or not the trees had PFAS in the first place. So given our expedited timeline and to be conservative, we opted to just dispose of the trees and all the vegetation with our PFAS impacted soils. Some other challenges with disposing of PFAS waste, and specifically waste that has AFFF, is that not all facilities will let you dispose of it as non-hazardous, and some facilities just won't accept it at all. Additionally, if it's disposed of as non-hazardous now, then that means that there are potential cradle to grave liabilities for our clients. To be most conservative and to help reduce potential future liability, all of our soil and our green waste was disposed of at a hazardous waste landfill. And the facility that we selected had a closed loop leachate collection system. And I should note that not all disposal facilities have a closed loop collection system, and some send their leachate to a treatment facility or dispose of it with other methods. So this is something that you should consider when you're selecting a disposal facility for your projects too. The next planning consideration we worked through was potential exposure to on-site workers and the surrounding community during construction. The main exposure pathway for PFAS is ingestion, and these compounds are not readily volatile, but there's the potential that PFAS that's sorbed to your soils may be ingested by on-site workers if dust is generated during construction. As part of our ISR work plan, we developed a soil screening level and an ambient air exposure concentration based on acute exposure scenarios. The soil screening level developed represented a health-based screening criterion for soil, and it was predicted based on worker inhalation exposure during construction with the potential that dust would be generated. So in theory, if you have soil concentrations that are substantially below this value, then you're unlikely to require ambient air monitoring. And our highest concentrations in soil at the site were well below our calculated value, but to be conservative and to confirm this risk, we opted to implement an air monitoring plan during construction. The ambient air exposure concentration developed was based on our highest soil concentrations at our site, and we correlated it to a total dust concentration. And that was used by our field staff. We developed real-time alert and action levels so our field staff could measure real-time time-weighted averages in the field to evaluate potential exposure. The real-time dust monitoring included upwind, downwind, and personnel air monitoring using a dust monitor, which you can see pictured on this slide in the right photo and in the middle. The personnel dust monitor was placed inside the excavator, and we left the door open when we were excavating so that the air monitor could be indicative of worker exposure scenarios. Our upwind and downwind stations were placed on the fence line of the work area, and we determined their placement each day based on wind direction. And so if the wind direction changed, then we'd move our air monitors accordingly. We also collected lab samples every day for analysis of PFAS and total dust, and that was collected at our downwind monitoring location. And the photo that's shown on the left of this slide shows the sampling media that we were provided by the lab, which consists of a low volume puff tube. The results from our real-time dust monitoring at all three of our stations were below our established alert levels, which indicated that we did not generate dust that posed a risk to our workers on site. And our laboratory samples did not have detections of PFAS or total dust, which indicated that our construction activities did not pose a risk to the surrounding community or to the facility personnel that were working and training at the site. As mentioned previously, to be protective of the environment, given that we were leaving residential SCTL exceedances all the way to the water table in place, we installed a low permeability liner at the bottom of the excavation, which you can see pictured here. The goals of the liner were to reduce infiltration through the impacted soils below, to reduce leaching to groundwater, and to reduce ponding and pooling with our completed excavation. So we didn't want to line an area that was going to fill up like a bathtub over time. And so our solution to that was that we proposed sloping the bottom of the excavation towards a gravel terminal drain that was located on the northern end, which is shown in the picture on the top left. This slide illustrates our backfill and liner design, and as you can see, we proposed installing a low permeability PVC liner at the bottom of the excavation, followed by a geotextile, which was intended to protect the liner during backfilling, so we didn't want it to tear while we were backfilling. And the bottom of the excavation was graded at a 1% slope towards our gravel terminal drain prior to placing the liner down. To evaluate the effectiveness of our sloping and the potential that the lined excavation area would fill up during an extreme weather event, we prepared a HELP model that included 3 runs using various soil types to verify that the water that infiltrates into our backfilled area above the lined excavation would not rise to the surface following a 25-year or 24-hour storm event. And based on these results, we concluded that the water would not reach the surface in any of the 3 scenarios, but we still opted to install the terminal drain just to help promote drainage anyway. And then the design also included a crown at the center of the backfilled area, so that would be the final grade, to help promote drainage away from the area, which you can see in the image pictured on the right. The liner extended, that's shown in the gray shading, extended along the bottom of the entire excavation area. And then the terminal drain that's outlined in blue was to the north, and the bottom was sloped. And then the crown that I referred to is shown in green. And last, but certainly not least, you should always expect the unexpected during construction. And I don't know how well you can see the colors on the screen, but what I want you to focus on is the blue colored soils that are shown in this zoomed in picture. These are not native to the site, and we hadn't seen soils that were this color encountered during all of our site assessment activities. And if you remembered, we collected quite a few samples. But we uncovered this soil when we were excavating adjacent to our industrial SCTL exceedance area. And it happens to be co-located right underneath where the protein-based foam was stored previously. So we think that the staining is related to that foam, and actually The soil had a really, really strong and pungent odor, which we also think is related to the degradation of that protein-based foam over time. We continued excavating these soils with this blue coloring and used the odor as an indicator as well. And we ended up excavating an additional 10 by 12 footprint from 2 to 4 feet. And we collected a few sidewall samples of this blue colored soil. And interestingly, it didn't have our highest concentrations that we've seen at the site previously. During the entire project, we excavated a total of 891 tons of PFAS impacted material. We had a couple unexpected trucking delays once we started construction, which added some time, but the total amount of time was about 17 days. And our transportation and disposal costs were about $350 a ton to transport it and dispose of it as at a hazardous waste landfill. To summarize, planning for and executing an ISR for PFAS has some challenges that are important to consider. It's important to understand the cradle to grave liabilities and specific client and project objectives when evaluating your waste disposal options. It also might not always be cost effective to sample your green waste, but it should be kept in mind that because PFAS can accumulate in plant material, you should consider that when you're evaluating your waste disposal as well. The air monitoring that we conducted during this project indicated that the dust that we generated during construction did not pose a risk, but this is something to keep in mind when planning for your other projects too. And finally, some AFFF related sources can have colors and odorous indicators, but that might not always be indicative of the highest concentrations that you're going to see at the site. Thanks so much, everybody, for the time. I hope you guys learned some stuff, and I'll take any questions if you have them.
Hi, this is not just a question for you, but for the other gentlemen on the panel. Has anybody considered high temperature degradation for these polyfluorinated compounds? Some years ago, we used high temperature thermal destruction on polyhalogenated phenols, which are, are very hard compounds to dissociate. And we then would scrub for the HCl and the HBr. And I was wondering if these PFAS compounds could be amenable to that.
Yeah, I am aware of some pilot testing that has been done related to in situ smoldering of PFAS that's been pretty effective. But I think they're still at the pilot testing phase, and I don't know if you all have any other thoughts as well.
I would agree with that. I think the technology isn't quite there yet. At least there may be some static facilities in the country that can do it. But I know in the states I work in that currently there's a number of pilot tests that are going on. In fact, there's a couple of companies here that we partnered with and are partnering with to see if they can break the compounds down. The problem that you don't want is if you're not breaking them down, and then, they're launched out the stack, you've created a worse condition. So to answer your question, yes, that's the goal, but I don't know that we're there yet.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that is that also the concern about what are the maybe potential intermediate compounds that might be produced in that. Right. So.
Well, that's why I said you'd have to scrub the stack very, very efficiently.
Absolutely.
Had to do, but the system that we used was a portable system. I think it operated around 1,500 C, but don't quote me on that.
Yeah.
On that last number.
That might not be high enough. I'm not sure.
Thank you. And I apologize for doing this, folks, but my name is John LaChance. I work with TerraTherm, which is a thermal remediation company. And you guys are right on. There are technologies. We have a patented technology for using excavated soil. For example, you can place it into a pile. We heat it up to 300, 350 C, and that's been proven to be, provide the mechanisms for substantial degradation within the soil You can get some volatilization of the lighter precursors, and so you do need an active vapor extraction treatment system, but that can be a catalytic unit or it can be a thermal oxidizer. And then you're basically scrubbing for HF. You do generate an aqueous stream that has to be treated because you will have to have a condenser up front to handle the steam drive out of the soil. But in addition to Sabron's STAR technology, which is very effective, you can also do it in an ex situ pile using basic thermal conduction heating technologies that are out there, and heat that pile up again to 350 C, 300 C, and that's been proven to be very effective for removal of the PFAS from the soil. Yep. We get complete mineralization and formation of HF in the soil. Again, as you're heating it up, you go from, when the soil dries out at 100 degrees C, you then raise the temperature, then starts to climb to what we call superheated temperatures. And that along the way, you're going to have precursor compounds in there that are smaller, more like shorter chained aliphatics, say, 2-3 carbon lengths, and those will volatilize. And we do see those coming out. But they can be handled, they have to be handled in either absorption media or thermal oxidizer or something if you don't want to deal with carbon and stuff. So, oh yeah, full of surprises.
John, hey, John, before you put that microphone down, do you have an approximate cost per
Yeah,
ton?
so the pile treatment costs, we've done probably, I think it's 11 or 12 high temp projects like this. So if we're doing a pile, the costs are in the range of $250 to $300 a cubic yard. But it really depends on the volume. So much of the pile technology is soil handling. And as you did such a nice job of talking about all the issues in monitoring and dust control, I mean, that all has to be factored into it. But if you got a bunch of drums, then it's fairly straightforward, or an existing pile. Yeah, it's really soil handling and throughput. So you size the piles to sort of be most economical on the total volume you have to treat and the footprint you have to work with. Yeah.
Thank you. Olivia, I have a question. So there were some totes and some free product of AFFF. What was the disposition of the
Test in my memory.
materials?
I want to say they were transported offsite for incineration, and I'm looking at you. He's nodding his head. So yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
great.
Yeah, great presentation. I thought it was interesting when you mentioned that the plans had PFAS. I was wondering if phytoremediation was considered and if it's a feasible option.
Yeah, phytoremediation has, I think they've done some pilot tests for it, or are working on some pilot tests here in the state for groundwater treatment specifically. And I've read some theories about using phytoremediation with grasses to treat surface soils, but I think it's still kind of a new type of thought and technology. I know that wasn't a very satisfying answer, so I'm sorry.
Any other questions before we all go have a cocktail? None. None.
Thank you.
Thank you. Awesome. That was a great panel. You guys did great. I like the national perspective.
Oh, good. Thank you. Yeah.